$18 trillion. That's the volume of global trade that just shifted away from the US dollar in coordinated moves between Moscow and Beijing, not over decades, over 18 months. And the mechanism they're using wasn't built in some back room last year. It's been under construction since 2014, waiting for the exact moment when Western sanctions would make it impossible to ignore. And here's what that means for your purchasing power, your savings, and the value of every dollar sitting in your bank account right now. When two of the world's largest economies decide the dollar is optional, the cost gets absorbed somewhere. That somewhere is American grocery bills, fuel prices, and the interest rate on your mortgage. Every time Beijing and Moscow settle a transaction in yuan, or rubles instead of dollars, a tiny piece of American economic leverage evaporates. Multiply that by billions of transactions, and you're watching the architecture of global finance get rewired in real time. This channel runs on no corporate funding, no government backing, and no advertising pressure telling us what to leave out. If this kind of analysis matters to you, the kind that connects currency swaps in Shanghai to price tags in Ohio, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. The mainstream coverage will tell you this is just diplomacy. Let me show you why it's economic warfare in slow motion. Let me walk you through exactly what happened and why every central bank governor in the West spent the last 6 weeks in closed-door meetings trying to figure out how to respond. On February 8, 2026, Russia's central bank announced it had completed a currency swap agreement with the People's Bank of China worth 6 trillion rubles. That's roughly 65 billion at current exchange rates. The agreement allows both nations to settle trade directly in their own currencies without converting to dollars first. China buys Russian oil and gas in yuan. Russia buys Chinese machinery and electronics in rubles. No dollars touch the transaction. No American bank processes the payment. No SWIFT system routes the transfer. The official statement from Moscow called it a routine financial arrangement designed to reduce transaction costs and increase efficiency. The official statement from Beijing echoed the same language. Routine, efficiency, stability. Standard central bank vocabulary that signals absolutely nothing is happening, except everything is happening, because this isn't the first agreement. It's the 47th since 2022. Russia and China have been building a parallel financial system, one bilateral agreement at a time, and February's announcement was just the largest single swap in the series. The total volume of yuan-ruble trade has grown 340% since Western sanctions hit Russia in 2022. The infrastructure didn't appear overnight. It's been under construction for over a decade. Here's what the official story won't tell you. When Russia got cut off from SWIFT in March 2022, Western officials assumed financial isolation would cripple Moscow's ability to conduct international trade. The assumption was simple. No access to dollar-denominated banking means no access to global markets. That assumption lasted about 6 weeks. Then China stepped in with an alternative. Not a replacement for SWIFT exactly. Something quieter. The Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, CIPS. China's answer to SWIFT launched in 2015, but dormant for years, while Beijing waited for the right geopolitical moment to make it relevant. Russia's exclusion from SWIFT became that moment. CIPS allows banks in Russia and China to transfer funds directly without routing through New York, London, or Frankfurt. No Western intermediary. No dollar conversion requirement. No visibility for U.S. Treasury officials monitoring sanctions compliance. As of January 2026, CIPS processes over 950 billion in transactions per month. That's up from 340 billion per month in early 2023. The growth curve is exponential, and it's accelerating. Now let me show you the technical architecture that makes this possible, and why it represents a structural threat to dollar dominance that most analysts are either missing or deliberately ignoring. The global financial system has operated on a simple rule for 80 years. If you want to buy oil, semiconductors, wheat, or weapons on the international market, you convert your local currency into US dollars first. This isn't law. It's not written in any treaty. It's simply how the system evolved after Bretton Woods in 1944, when the dollar became the world's reserve currency. The result is that roughly 60% of global foreign exchange reserves are held in dollars. Central banks around the world stockpile dollars because they need them to participate in international trade. That system gives the United States an extraordinary advantage. Washington can print dollars to finance deficits because global demand for dollars remains constant. Other nations have to earn dollars through exports or borrow them at interest. The U.S. just issues them. It's the closest thing to a free lunch in economics. As long as the world needs dollars, America can run trillion-dollar deficits without the same inflationary consequences other nations would face. But that entire system rests on one assumption: there is no viable alternative. The moment a critical mass of countries can conduct trade without converting to dollars first, the demand for dollars drops. And when demand for dollars drops, the value of every dollar in circulation falls. That's not theory. That's supply and demand. And that's exactly what Russia and China are building: an alternative. The mechanism is surprisingly simple. China and Russia establish a swap line. Russia deposits rubles. China deposits yuan. When a Russian company wants to buy Chinese goods, it pays in rubles. Those rubles go to the Russian central bank, which converts them to yuan using the swap line and transfers yuan to the Chinese exporter. No dollars, no Western banks. The transaction happens entirely outside the dollar system. The same process works in reverse when China buys Russian energy. Now here's the part that makes this more dangerous than a simple bilateral trade agreement. China isn't just doing this with Russia. Beijing has established similar currency swap agreements with over 40 countries: Brazil, Argentina, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Pakistan, Indonesia, Turkey. The list grows every quarter. Each agreement represents another bilateral channel where trade can happen without dollars. Individually, these agreements are small. Collectively, they represent an alternative financial architecture that bypasses Western control. And here's the number that should terrify every Treasury official in Washington. In 2021, before the Ukraine war and before sanctions isolated Russia, yuan-denominated trade accounted for roughly 2% of global transactions. As of March 2026, that number is 14%. The yuan is now the fourth most used currency in international transactions, behind only the dollar, euro, and pound. More importantly, the growth trajectory shows no signs of slowing. China has spent 2 decades building the infrastructure for yuan internationalization: CIPs, currency swaps, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Belt and Road Initiative. Every piece was designed to support this exact moment when countries would have a reason to move away from the dollar. Russia gave them that reason. Western sanctions on Moscow sent a clear signal to every government outside the NATO alliance: if you become a geopolitical adversary of Washington, your access to the global financial system can be severed overnight. That's a powerful deterrent if you're isolated. It's a powerful incentive to find alternatives if you're not. China, India, Brazil, and the Gulf states all watched what happened to Russia and drew the same conclusion: dollar dependence is a strategic vulnerability, and Beijing is offering a solution. Now let me show you the math that makes this transition inevitable if current trends hold, and why the United States has no answer that doesn't involve either backing down or escalating in ways that accelerate the very process Washington is trying to stop. The math is brutal. The United States imports roughly $3.8 trillion in goods and services annually. To pay for those imports, the rest of the world needs dollars. So foreign companies and governments accumulate dollars by exporting to the U.S. or to other countries in dollar-denominated transactions. The result is a system where global demand for dollars remains high, which keeps the dollar strong, which keeps U.S. borrowing costs low. But here's the trap. The only way to supply the world with enough dollars to facilitate global trade is for the United States to run a trade deficit. If the U.S. ran a trade surplus, dollars would flow back into the United States, and the global supply of dollars would shrink. That would make international trade harder and reduce demand for dollars, which would defeat the entire purpose of reserve currency status. So the U.S. has to run deficits. It's not a choice. It's a structural requirement of the system. That deficit is currently financed by foreign buyers of U.S. Treasury bonds. China, Japan, and Gulf oil exporters buy U.S. debt, which gives the U.S. government the dollars it needs to continue spending beyond its revenue. The system works as long as those foreign creditors keep buying bonds. The moment they stop, interest rates in the United States spike, borrowing costs explode, and the federal government faces a choice between austerity or inflation. And here's what Russia and China just did. They reduced their need to hold dollars. Russia can't buy U.S. treasuries anymore due to sanctions. China has been slowly reducing its treasury holdings for 5 years. In 2021, China held $1.07 trillion in U.S. debt. As of February 2026, that number is down to $720 billion, a $350 billion reduction. Where did that money go? Into gold, commodities, and yuan-denominated assets. China is diversifying away from dollar dependence deliberately and incrementally. Now multiply that across dozens of countries making the same calculation, and you get a slow, steady decline in foreign demand for U.S. debt. The Congressional Budget Office projects the U.S. will need to borrow $7 trillion in 2027 to cover the federal deficit. If foreign buyers absorb $1 trillion of that, domestic buyers have to absorb $7 trillion. If foreign buyers only absorb $700 billion, domestic buyers have to cover $2 trillion. The less foreign demand there is, the higher interest rates have to go to attract domestic buyers. Higher interest rates mean higher costs on mortgages, car loans, credit cards, and business financing. That cost doesn't hit the federal government in isolation. It hits every American who borrows money. And here's the asymmetry that makes this a losing equation for Washington. China and Russia benefit even if yuan internationalization grows slowly. Every percentage point of global trade that shifts from dollars to yuan reduces Beijing's exposure to U.S. sanctions and increases China's financial leverage in Asia. Russia benefits by maintaining access to Chinese goods, energy markets, and financial services, despite being cut off from the West. They're not trying to replace the dollar overnight. They're trying to build an alternative that's good enough to reduce dependence. And they're succeeding. The United States, on the other hand, loses leverage with every transaction that moves off the dollar system. The ability to freeze assets, block transactions, and impose financial sanctions is the most powerful non-military tool Washington has. That tool only works if everyone uses the dollar system. The moment a viable alternative exists, U.S. leverage shrinks. And unlike China and Russia, the United States can't respond by building a better financial system. It already has the dominant system. The only response is to make using that system more attractive or to make using alternatives more costly. And right now, Washington is doing neither. Let me show you why this matters beyond currency markets and central bank balance sheets. Let me show you how this plays out on the global chessboard and why every adversary of the United States is watching this experiment with intense interest. China's strategic calculation here is straightforward. Beijing watched the United States use financial sanctions as a weapon for 3 decades. Iraq, Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, Libya, Syria, Russia. Every time the same playbook. Cut the target off from dollar-denominated trade, freeze their assets in Western banks, and wait for economic collapse to force capitulation. The strategy worked in some cases. It failed in others. But the mere threat of sanctions gave Washington enormous leverage over any country dependent on the dollar system for survival. China is not going to let that happen to Beijing. The leadership in China looked at what happened to Russia and understood the message. If China moves on Taiwan, the West will try to do to Beijing what it did to Moscow. Freeze assets, cut off SWIFT access, sanction every major Chinese bank. The economic damage would be catastrophic if China had no alternative. So China is building one, not as a replacement, as insurance. The worse U.S.-China relations get, the more important that insurance becomes. And here's the dimension almost nobody in the Western press is saying plainly. This isn't just about currency. It's about the rules of the international system. For 80 years, the United States and its allies wrote the rules. The Bretton Woods system, the World Bank, the IMF, the WTO, all designed and dominated by Western institutions. That system delivered enormous prosperity, and it also delivered enormous power to the countries that controlled it. China, Russia, and much of the global South were secondary players in a system they didn't design and couldn't control. Now they're building a parallel system, not better necessarily, but separate. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank as an alternative to the World Bank, SIPs as an alternative to SWIFT, yuan swap lines as an alternative to dollar dependence, the Belt and Road Initiative as an alternative to Western-led development. Each piece is a brick in a structure that allows countries to participate in global trade and finance without needing permission from Washington, London, or Brussels. Russia is not leading this project. Russia is the test case. China is leading it. And the message Beijing is sending to every government in Asia, Africa, and Latin America is simple. You don't have to choose between China and the West. You can trade with both. But if you ever find yourself on the wrong side of Washington's foreign policy, we can keep you connected to global markets in ways the West cannot cut off. That message is resonating. In the last 18 months, over 30 countries have applied to join the BRICS economic bloc. BRICS now represents 47% of the global population and over 35% of global GDP. If even half of those applicants are admitted, the bloc will control more economic output than the G7. And the stated goal of BRICS expansion is to reduce dependence on Western financial systems. Now watch what's happening in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia has been a cornerstone of the petrodollar system since 1974. The deal was simple. Saudi Arabia sells oil in dollars. In exchange, the United States provides military protection and political support. That arrangement has kept global oil markets denominated in dollars for 5 decades, which in turn keeps global demand for dollars high. In December 2025, Saudi Arabia signed a currency swap agreement with China worth $7 billion. The agreement allows Saudi Arabia to sell oil to China in yuan instead of dollars. The Saudis called it a diversification strategy. China called it a deepening of bilateral ties. The United States said nothing publicly. But behind closed doors, Washington is watching the kingdom's slow pivot toward Beijing with alarm. Because if Saudi oil trades in yuan, the entire petrodollar architecture starts to crack. The UAE followed with a similar agreement in January 2026. Qatar is reportedly negotiating one now. The Gulf states are not abandoning the dollar, but they're creating optionality. And optionality is the first step toward transition. 20 years from now, if the dollar is no longer the dominant global reserve currency, historians will point to this period between 2022 and 2027 as the moment when the foundation started to shift. Russia is watching this with quiet satisfaction. Moscow is not trying to build a new reserve currency. The ruble will never replace the dollar. But Russia doesn't need to replace the dollar. It just needs to survive outside the dollar system long enough for alternatives to mature. And it's succeeding. Despite the most comprehensive sanctions regime ever imposed on a major economy, Russia's GDP grew 1% in 2025. Inflation is high but manageable. Trade with China, India, and the global south has more than offset the loss of European markets. The survival of the Russian economy under sanctions is proof of concept for every country wondering whether Western financial weapons are as devastating as Washington claims. And here's what should worry every strategic planner in the Pentagon. This isn't just about economics. It's about military logistics. If China can trade with Russia, Iran, and North Korea outside the dollar system, U.S. sanctions lose their ability to constrain military cooperation between adversaries. The reason the United States could limit Iran's ballistic missile program for decades was financial pressure. Tehran couldn't access the technology and components it needed because sanctions cut it off from dollar-denominated trade. Now Iran can buy what it needs from China and pay in yuan or barter. Russia can supply missile technology to North Korea and receive payment in commodities or renminbi. The financial walls that kept adversaries isolated are developing cracks. Now let me show you where this goes if nothing changes. Let me show you the 3 most likely scenarios over the next 24 months and why 2 of them end badly for American economic dominance. Scenario 1, slow erosion, the most likely outcome. Yuan internationalization continues at its current pace. Another 15 to 20 countries sign currency swap agreements with China over the next 2 years. The share of global trade conducted in yuan grows from 14% to 22%. The dollar remains the dominant reserve currency but loses 5 to 8 percentage points of market share. U.S. Treasury borrowing costs rise by 40 to 60 basis points as foreign demand for U.S. debt softens. The average American sees this as slightly higher mortgage rates and credit card interest. Not a crisis. Just a slow transfer of wealth from the United States to creditor nations. It's manageable, but it's irreversible. Scenario 2, accelerated transition. The less likely but higher impact scenario. A major geopolitical event triggers mass movement away from the dollar. The trigger could be a U.S. debt ceiling crisis that spooks foreign creditors. It could be a military confrontation over Taiwan that prompts China to weaponize its treasury holdings. It could be a rapid collapse in confidence in U.S. fiscal policy. Whatever the trigger, the result is the same. A rush for the exits. Foreign central banks dump treasuries. The dollar loses 15% of its value in 6 months. Inflation in the United States spikes to 8%. Interest rates hit 7%. The federal government faces a choice between austerity that crashes the economy or money printing that destroys the currency. This is the nightmare scenario Treasury officials wargame in classified briefings. Scenario 3, managed bifurcation. The optimistic scenario. The United States and China negotiate a controlled transition to a multipolar currency system. The dollar remains dominant in the West. The yuan dominates in Asia. Both systems interoperate, but neither has unilateral control. It's the least disruptive outcome. It's also the least likely because it requires both Washington and Beijing to accept limits on their own power and there's no evidence either side is willing to do that. Here's my assessment of the probabilities. Scenario 1 is 70% likely. Scenario 2 is 20% likely. Scenario 3 is 10% likely. And all three scenarios share one outcome: American economic leverage declines. The only variable is speed. What burned into the global financial system this winter is not just a currency swap or a trade agreement. It's the realization that the United States cannot stop this process without tools it's unwilling to use. Washington could respond with military force, but that would accelerate the very coalition building it's trying to prevent. The U.S. could offer better terms for dollar use, but that would require fiscal discipline and trade policies the political system shows no ability to adopt. Or Washington can watch as the system that gave America unparalleled economic power for 80 years gets slowly, methodically dismantled by rivals who studied that system, learned its pressure points, and built an alternative designed specifically to withstand American financial weapons. The prediction with a clock attached: within 18 months, at least one major European economy signs a yuan currency swap with China, probably Germany, possibly France. When that happens, the dollar's dominance in global trade will have fallen below 50% for the first time since World War II. The transition won't be loud. It'll be a quiet announcement from the Bundesbank framed as risk management, but it will mark the point where even U.S. allies are hedging against dollar dependence. Drop your prediction in the comments. Which scenario plays out? Slow erosion, rapid crisis, or managed bifurcation? And what's your timeline? Tell me, because I read every single one, and the range of perspectives in this community is better than any think tank analysis I've seen. If this gave you a framework for understanding currency wars that the mainstream financial press didn't, share it with one person who still thinks this is just about exchange rates and trade balances. It's not. It's about the architecture of power, and that architecture is being rewired while most people aren't watching. The next video goes into the specific mechanisms China is using to make the yuan attractive to central banks that have never held Chinese currency before. Subscribe so you're there when it lands.